How are you doing, Jason?
Oh, I can't hear you. Wait a minute. I don't know why that is.
Can you hear us? Hello?
Oh, that's better.
Yeah, that's good.
Fantastic. I can hear you now. Good morning. Good afternoon.
Good
morning. Nice wallpaper.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Robotic arms projects.
Yes. Yeah, I'm at home today, so I've got some wallpaper.
Oh, today's work from home.
Yes, it's Friday, so I need to leave home early. So
Oh yeah.
I have a studio on my rooftop. So yes. So this is my microphone okay?
Yes, clear.
Very good. Let's check screen share.
Thank you for yesterday. Your sharing is so inspirations and many good feedback. So we're looking forward for today.
Excellent. No, it was really good fun, and hopefully we can keep the conversation going. I'll just try one thing to see if it. Oh. Does that sound coming through there?
Follow me to the river where on these streets you can discover every part of me. Follow me.
Great, that works. Fantastic. It seems we have presentation, audio, and I can see and hear you, which is fantastic. So Friday afternoon in Hong Kong.
Yes.
Nearly the weekend.
Yeah, long weekend for us.
It's a long weekend.
Yeah, 3 days.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah.
What's trying to think? What's the occasion?
A festival. There's
Festival.
Festival.
Okay, very good.
You know that festival?
I'm just trying to think. It's a long time. I lived in Hong Kong in the mid-90s.
You remember that? The dragon boat. The dragon boat.
Oh yes, I remember Dragon Boat. Yeah.
So with rice, the
rice
dumpling, yeah.
Okay, very good.
Remember that? The rice dumpling with the lid?
I do remember rice dumplings, yes.
Tasty.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, I worked in Hong Kong as a student on the airport with Norman Foster.
Yes, I remember that. Yeah.
Yes.
How long have you stayed in Hong Kong?
For 1 year.
For 1 year. So you work at that company for that years?
Yeah.
So you really understand Hong Kong, the festival, the food?
A little bit. Yeah, no, lots of fun, lots of traveling around Hong Kong and also into China.
Yes. For working, travel to China, right?
Yeah, well, now I travel to China for work.
Oh, now, yes.
Yeah, then it was for being a tourist.
Some projects in China before, right?
Yes. Last year we finished a project for Vanka in Chengdu, an artwork there. Actually, I could probably share that. And also a project for SKP in Xi'an as well, a temporary lighting work there.
Yes, quite a lot of job in Asia.
Yeah, quite a few. And then, yeah.
And the robotic arm is in Japan, right?
Yeah, so hopefully, it's a bit complicated. We start traveling to Japan in 2 weeks' time.
Oh.
Sounds really exciting.
The bit that's not exciting is the government quarantine and then the isolation.
Oh yeah, yeah. You have to stay in hotel for 14 days.
For the moment, it's 6 days from the UK, 6 days in a hotel, followed by 8 days in isolation.
Oh, oh.
With 3 tests. So you've got to love your work.
Yes. So when will be the show date of that Japan's projects?
22nd of July.
Mm.
So yeah.
22nd. Wow.
Very soon.
Yeah, very soon.
Yeah.
Thank you, my good vibes for the setup.
Yes. Must be many different technical problems you have to face, maybe.
Yeah, we've got 3 separate teams going from the UK, but
Wow.
it would have been like 20, 30 people, and it's 7 people now. So we have to work with we have to do lots of training and lots of handovers in Tokyo.
Yeah. Hopefully everything goes smooth.
Yeah, it will be fine. It'll be good.
Yes, that's it.
So maybe I think it's like it's a good time for us to start the talk today. It's a really exciting talk. Actually, it's also like a question. I mean, a lot of like artists who think about like how to maintain the studios running, but at the same time have like a balance between the commercial and the artistic practice.
So you
Very
can
good.
start the presentation?
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely. And I have to say, I mean, if people want to ask questions, type them into the chat on Zoom. So I might stop and answer it or talk about something else. So yeah, please do. If you don't want to, or if you're feeling really brave, raise your hand in Zoom and you can ask me any question.
Yes.
So don't wait till the end because there's a small enough group of people that we can chat as we talk. So anyway, good afternoon, everyone. I think you probably all saw me yesterday. If you didn't, my name's Jason Bruge. I'm an architect trained media artist. I live in London. I'm actually sat in my studio top, my rooftop studio in West London, which is at my house. Although my main studio is in East London. So, and I commute back and forwards through London on my bicycle every day. So that's a 10-kilometer commute across London, but it's very cycling friendly. And it's not a bad day. It's quite warm, but not as warm as you are probably. We've got about 26 degrees, I think, here today, and the sun will be out later. So, and thank you for joining. I know it's sort of coming towards your weekend, so good to see you all. So I'm going to talk about, yesterday I talked about my art practice, which is the majority of what my studio does. And the studio is not just me. I've got 30 other people in the studio that come from a big variety of backgrounds, and they're all hugely important to creating the work. So there are scientists, engineers, computational designers, interaction designers, 3D designers, artists, architects, graphic designers, performance artists, people with all sorts of skills. And the studio is quite unusual in that a lot of the work's commissioned. So we're not represented by a gallery. The work's all to commission. So essentially, people come to the studio for work. And that might come from governments, mayors, developers, cultural institutions, infrastructure projects. So quite a wide range of projects. And some ones I'm going to talk to today, quite a lot of them have quite sort of not constrained, but they have briefs really that align them more with design projects, because there are parameters and things that people need to get from their projects. And as you can see, it might be someone who has an exhibition and they're trying to tell a story, and I'm helping them tell that story. Or it might be a brand who's trying to create some leverage from what we're doing in terms of sort of creating an event or exposure. And for them, they're using, I suppose, they think they're using an artist to sort of create stories and create some leverage, essentially. And obviously, going on this journey, I'm using a lot of applied technology within the work, but it's still very much about the kind of storytelling. Now, so yeah, the work's very much commissioned. It's in two worlds. So we talked a lot about the art commissions yesterday, and we'll touch more on the design commissions and the sort of exhibition commissions. And these two, I'm actually going to talk weirdly. I'm talking a little bit about this because it is in a museum context, the Victoria and Albert Museum, a piece called Mirror Mirror, and this was a piece called Reveal for Aston Martin.
I didn't get that. Could you?
So, and this is sort of a snapshot of some pieces of work that gives you an idea. I thought I'd just give you an idea about some of the clients and commissioners that come to the studio. So, Dyson is one, for example. So I've collaborated with Jake Dyson, who's the son of James Dyson, the founder, but also created work that talks about some of the characteristics of their products. Actually, a similar project, I've been working as artist in residence for LG for a few years, working on projects that have been showed at trade shows. That's not here, but I just thought of that. Ebb and Flow is a retail piece, and actually, interestingly, looking at developing that at the moment for project in Dubai. More for I'm going to show you. That's a project for one of our one of our TV channels, Channel 4. It's sort of quite an art, culture and arts-based TV channel. And they had an identity which they wanted to actually create through actually building something. Curious Canopy was an artwork for Intel, and it's a project using their products, their single board computers, to create an architectural artwork for one of their trade shows. The Living Planet Centre is an exhibition for the World Wildlife Fund to talk about the charity. Mercedes Drive-Through was a collaboration with Bompus and Parr. They are food designers, food experience designers. I collaborated with them on this drive-through for Mercedes. That was a kind of drive-through in Selfridges. Bloomberg Connects is quite an interesting one. A project sponsored by Bloomberg, the sort of financial information and news company. And they quite often sponsor projects at the Tate Modern or for the Tate in London. And we created a sort of series of interventions that were encouraging people to interact with the building and with the collections. So not so much an artwork, but a device for creating conversations. And actually what was interesting about that project, there was all sorts of things. We use a lot of recycled technology. So we actually worked with Bloomberg and used lots of their old technology and upcycled it and used it within that project. And it was a sort of combination of old technology being used alongside, we were using Raspberry Pis, I think, in terms of creating media servers to push information to those screens. Lightspace Modulator was a performance and intervention for a lighting company on the south bank of the Thames, working with the South Bank Centre. It's a big art centre, the south of the Thames. Mimosa was working with Philips, and one reveal I talked about, which is the piece for Aston Martin. So I kind of touched on the themes yesterday, and the process and the philosophy is no different when you're working for a brand. They're buying into my thought process, they're buying into the studio, they're buying into how we work. So we can protect that, but equally you're being asked to do very, very precise things. And I thought I'd start with one project in particular that had a very particular brief. Let me find it. And this was one of the artist's impressions we created. So this environment called Aerial Dynamics was an internal, it was an installation to sit inside a pavilion at the 2012 Olympics in London. Our client was Coca-Cola, and they wanted to create this celebratory, festive kind of installation that would celebrate things like medals being won, but also it aligned in some ways sort of to the ambient branding around Coca-Cola. And large part of it was around the sort of use of bubbles. So one of our big challenges was how to create, and they wanted us to differentiate, they wanted to create this immersive environment, but they didn't want us to use screen technology. Even at that time, there was a proliferation of LED matrix screens and the use of media surfaces. So suddenly you're getting a lot of brands using digital media around that environment. And it was like, how can you make this different? How does it not look like everything else? Because you've got to think it's very easy to get given technology, and Hong Kong actually is a fantastic place for technology and the application of it. It's world leading, but you've got to think about quite often how to use that technology. Are there ways of subverting or changing how it's used so it looks different and it's original and novel and interesting? And in this context, it was, we don't want a flat screen. We want something spatial. We want something that envelops us. We want something that's immersive. So we were thinking about, first of all, how can we make these bubbles? And like a technological bubble, how do you make that? I mean, do you make it from real bubble mixture? So we were sort of sketching, we were sketching very early on these sort of strange, quite weird looking actually when I look back at it, devices with these bubbles that could expand and contract. And the client really liked this, but we didn't really like how it looked. These look a bit scaly. They look like kind of like they're reptiles or something like that. But I just thought I'd give you a bit of an insight to sort of how we're working here. So we started looking at inflatable bubbles. So this is us just pulling and pushing a diaphragm, which is internally lit. I suspect we're using an Arduino there just to change the color of the light inside the, I mean, essentially this is a piece of, we've glued some plastic together and there's one RGB LED inside, and we're using some string to expand and contract it. And this is a prototype we created in a day. So it's like quick, right? To be fair, there's a design engineer working on the project who knows how to sort of create a breadboard, an Arduino set up very quickly, and working with a plastic, you can do that very quickly. But sometimes you want to see what something looks like, but it doesn't have to be the finished thing. So we could have had an air pump and motorized that, but equally we're just using a piece of string. It's almost like a puppet, but it talks about something moving. It talks about something being animated very, very quickly. Now, and it's just about how to prototype things and how to make things quickly. And there's no, for me, I'm always interested in emulating. By that I mean you're kind of thinking about how can I make something that looks like what I'm trying to make at the end, but you don't need to necessarily know all of the skills to get there. Because like when you when you grow into your career, you'll be working with groups of people and teams of people, and you have specialists that you can go to for certain things. So if you don't know how to inflate a kind of balloon via an electronic system, you can pretend you do, but as long as it's convincing. Now, quite early on, we thought, well, inflation and deflation really quickly wasn't quick enough. So
countdown, 3, 2, 1, go.
So this was us looking at other ways of creating the illusion of a balloon or a spherical surface. And we're just twisting these polypropylene strands in and out so they nest. So that's a sort of changing shape. But obviously, we've just used some strips of polypropylene, some cable ties, and a couple of bits of metal pipe just to create the illusion again of a bubble changing and being animated. And this is the next version. And I think from memory, this is a broom handle plus an elastic band, some polypropylene, and again, some cable ties. So the idea of, you know, generating things that are very kind of crude and raw and simple, first of all. If you're making prototypes, you're thinking about things, always start from the kind of simple premise of what you're trying to do. Because we've not jumped into electronics at this point. This is just purely us talking about a shape and a movement and a color and the sort of opacity of it. And there's all sorts of things going on here. But you're immediately, you know, you're talking about, you know, a bubble. Now, what does light do when you add light to something like this? So again, we don't need to add any electronics at this stage, but we can just add one lamp, which is illuminating it from the bottom, just to sort of look, how does the light catch this object? Again, I'm not trying to animate the light. We're not changing color. It's just on. We've just got a benchtop power supply. And again, we're doing variations. You know, does that get thicker? But of course, you can jump in and out of the computer. So one of the next steps was to start looking at how that would expand and contract. And this is using, we're using Cinema 4D here to animate what this looks like. And of course, there are some more mechanical things we've added here, but we're getting an idea of how that might move and what it might do. So this is our sort of mechanical bubble. And one of the interesting things that always happens when you're creating these sorts of prototypes, you can hear the motors are making a certain sort of sound. So you've got to decide whether you want to mask that or keep it. There are always really interesting things you find out as you start to prototype things. And then you jump back into your computer model. How do we create an animation within this environment in terms of how we were thinking here? How do you create an interaction? You're creating a sort of spatial environment and you want some trigger to happen, some event that triggers something that's happening around you. Again, it's not rendered in full photo realized. This is a very simple wireframe, just to show the essence of it. But it is good to sort of try things out. This is a sort of slightly larger scale mock-up of the installation. And this was happening in the early summer of 2012, prior to us installing this in the Olympics. So we had to do some soak testing. So when you're doing this sort of project, you quite often want to set the whole thing up and let it run. Because you want, again, I talked about things breaking yesterday, but you want to see what things are not going to work. Do remember that you can send me messages if you want to. You can ask me questions. Don't be shy. And what do these things look like when they're blooming in much larger numbers? So this is what we showed the client. and I'll show you how this worked in the final exhibition.
Follow me to the river where on these streets you can discover every part of me.
So this project sat within a pavilion designed by Asif Khan, and we created this interior installation of these sort of mechatronic bubbles. So mechatronic sort of means a kind of in between an electronic device and a mechanical device, and they're creating this kind of overhead aerial performance. And you walked up the outside of this pavilion, which had these ETFE cushions on the outside, and it was like a beatbox. So you could actually play. You could actually play with the architecture. So it was like a giant instrument, and then you'd come down on a helical ramp that inscribed was coming down the inside wall into this dark space where you experienced our installation. And then there was a bar where they served Coca-Cola. So it was a sort of experience all about really having a drink of Coca-Cola. So it's very extravagant, really, but interesting to sort of see the sort of design process that went into that. Well, this is some behind the scenes in the studio working on the project for More 4. Again, prototyping, building, testing, 6-week long project, start to finish. So we were actually approached by a branding agency called Man vs. Machine, who do a lot of kind of very dynamic, time-based brands. And this was about 6-7 years ago now. And they already had an idea of moving color field for the sort of branding for More 4, and had an idea of it being filmed in different sorts of locations, but had no idea how to make it. So we looked at very old-fashioned timetables, the split flap displays you've obviously seen, and usually they're rectangular in format. And there were some quite precise needs for the installation, but what they wanted us to do was build this thing from scratch and be able to run it to sort of create this color field. And never before had anyone made anything like this, or had anyone made it with triangles. We had to get the first working prototype in a day and the final working prototype done created in a week. So it was a very fast process. And these aren't blowing in the wind, they've got little motors, each one, which twists the carousel of moving colours. And whilst we're talking about technology today, interestingly, the only technology here really is a motor and a gear system per module. There's 600 modules, and the power goes on at the same time. And the only coding going on here is the kind of ordering of the colors in the cassette, which we had to know what order they were in. So we created a perfect color field. So it's like a pre-programmed animation, but the only programming is in the order of the colors within that cassette. And weirdly, it's probably my most famous piece of work, but it's only because it's been on TV for the last 6 years. And yeah, it was well received because it was a real life thing, and it wasn't made on the computer. It was filmed and with very little post-production. So it's kind of quite interesting, really, to sort of how hands-on you could be. And then there was a special version we made, which was filmed in Iceland. And absolutely no trickery there. That's for real snow, real moon in the north of Iceland somewhere. Unfortunately, I didn't get to go on that shoot, but it looked like a lot of fun. So with any exhibition, our work is site specific. We're looking very sort of carefully at the space it goes into. And I talked a bit about this project yesterday, but it's great to talk about the context of where you're working. And you'll obviously be working, I mean, it's a bit like thinking about a theatre and a stage, and you're creating a performance within it, essentially. This is the John Majeski garden at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Fantastic space dating from the mid-19th century, apart from the addition of the new elliptical pond. And I talked about this briefly. This project got very interested in the idea of narcissism. So this is the comes from the story that thinks about people being very much enveloped by their reflections and sort of falling in love with them, essentially. And this is sort of a painting that talks about this. So, and one of the things we always do when working on exhibitions and lots of projects, we'll test things in real life. So I'm there in my yellow cycling jacket, looking at some bits of digital technology which we've put in the pond to see how vibrant they look, what the contrast looks like. Are they visible enough? I believe that's the curator standing behind me, one of our designers on the left, and one of the creative technologists at the time, coding on site, just to sort of have a look at how these things would look on site. It's always really good to get out into the field and see what things look like. You know, are they square format? Are they horizontal format? Is it landscape? How does it sit against the architecture of the space? Is it bright enough? So when you're building your installations, you know, it's great to, you know, get out of your studio, your flat, your house, your office environment, your studio environment at college, and get into the environment you're actually going to be working in, and look at to see how things look is really important. But back in the studio, this is a setup. So this is a series of displays. They're very simple. So this technology is not quite obsolete. It's still used a little bit. It's LED matrix used often in signage, signs on, you might have seen it on like buses or stations, you know, kind of 1 pixel, about an 8mm pitch, which actually at a distance gives you some quite nice filmic imagery. It's actually, sometimes you don't need the most advanced technology to create something interesting. So this technology at 8 meters, that pitch of LEDs resolves into something filmic. You cannot tell it's made of dots. And that's a good rule of thumb if you're working with media, is to think about at what distance are you viewing it from and where are you viewing it from. Your viewing angle is also really important. Can I walk right round it and still see it at an oblique angle from a very kind of sideways angle? And what's happening here, we've got a camera on each of these modules to film the environment in front of it. So the spacing of these things is all derived from the camera lens. So the cameras are looking outwards to see what they can see. And they're these little kind of standing up rectangles because it's all about a standing portrait. So this was all about capturing people standing, looking at the artwork. So there's quite a lot in just thinking about your audience and where they are and how they relate to what you're creating. And that's installing. It's always nice to get footage of your work being created. If you're selling work to people or showing people, especially people who might be hiring you or collaborating with you, people will love to see how things are made, and never be kind of worried about kind of showing work that's underway or sketches or thoughts, and think about how you share that process. It's as important as the final work itself sometimes. So this work basically filmed people around the environment and created these kind of standing portraits which sat in a pond, which then reflected in turn in that pond. How we were picking up people in the dark. So there was no illumination of people's fronts. But up on the balcony here, we had a series of infrared lamps. So we were filling that space with infrared, and the cameras were very cheap, and we found they didn't have infrared filters on them, so that we could then pick up people moving around without having to front illuminate them. So it's a nice way of getting a lot of movement, and sometimes there are these little tricks, which means you don't need expensive heat cameras. This is just a very simple trick to pick up movement. Piece called Mirror Mirror at the Victoria Albert Museum. This is a little bit closer, and you can sort of see the effect of those that technology sitting in the water. Be very careful trying that sort of thing. We've got mains voltage going into water, so it all needs to be properly secured and waterproofed. And that sat in place for 9 months. So you're creating these sorts of things that you need to think about how they're going to last. How are you going to maintain them as well is the first question I always get asked. How do I take one of those, if one of those little totems stops working, how do I quickly swap that out in like under an hour, half an hour, like if it's worked? But the whole thing carried on working, so that wasn't a problem, but you've got to think about everything like that. Now, sometimes we get asked to exhibit things in strange places. In this project, we actually exhibited in the Long Museum in Shanghai in about 5-6 years ago, commissioned from the Great Britain campaign, which is a campaign run by the British government to celebrate British creativity and innovation. And we were invited to create an art installation, which will be exhibited briefly and filmed at 10 Downing Street. So this is us installing a brand new door for our government. We had to start by doing a site survey, which you do with all projects, so measuring everything. And we created our version of the number 10 Downing Street door. So you may have seen this on the TV, and it's certainly, we chose the site because it was something that had never been, it was seen by a lot of people. And installing the door, me looking at it, it's this door construction opens up. It was a digital piece of setworks, and we were able to sort of animate it from the outside. It's an absolutely perfect replica of the actual thing. Whoops. So as you can see, it was a kind of had active camouflage. So essentially you could see through it essentially. And that's Larry the cat who lives at number 10. But it's an object that we can move around. So it's a piece of, it's an exhibit, and it's moved around within the British government currently. So I know you're going to have lots of questions about the technology we use in this project. So this is a project for a company called MEC, who analyze how brands are doing. It was shown at Cannes Lions, which is the advertising Oscars in south of France. And we created a zoomorphic, so an animal-shaped lion made out of little screens, 169 little screens, each one with a Raspberry Pi shield on the back. So each screen's running off a Raspberry Pi. And we're polling a database, which is looking at all the conversations happening in Cannes. So it's a barometer for all of those conversations. So we're actually looking at certain Twitter hashtags and feeding those conversations into and onto our Lion as they happen live. So we're polling a database every 5 to 10 seconds. So it's completely alive piece. So and that was all about bringing the sort of idea of sort of data visualization away from like a big screen and breaking it down into much smaller elements. How could you create something that is not just a projection or a screen? Well, there's no way it could be deconstructed. So think about the technology using, think about how can you use it creatively. So that's a sort of an example, I would say, of potentially, you know, using a sort of collection of technology in a different way. So this project was for Intel. It was a ceiling for what their stand at one of the big technology fairs in Barcelona. And this ceiling mapped the movement of people. So each of those circles was an autonomous unit, meaning it works on its own and it's looking at what's happening beneath it. So it's got a sensor that can see activity. Each one is running off a small Intel computer. So it's got one single board computer, a little bit like an Arduino or Raspberry Pi, but it's an Intel version of those. And they're working autonomously, but they can obviously all work together. Now, we developed a system that meant we could talk to the whole array at the same time. So it can create these kind of very fluid movements. And it was about creating something that would become an attractor. It would kind of draw people in to that environment. And it does many things. So it's also mapping the movements of people, but also you can sort of play super graphics through it or highlight parts of the stand. So you can sort of see we're running in a sort of environment which is sort of playing it. So you can sort of literally see us sort of playing with our sort of media rings. And this is a sort of the technology setup, and the control system was developed in the studio. But what you'll find, what's interesting, obviously, we will occasionally get these commercial projects, but you'll see some of the learnings and some of the thinkings in that also appear in our artwork. So we created an artwork at Dallas Airport, which is all about mapping people on moving walkways, and it uses some of the technology we developed in this for Intel. So it's sort of, there's a bit of a cross-fertilization between some of the commercial work and some of the artworks that are happening. And artists will do that, and some will do it kind of invisibly and some will do it more outwardly. But you will create themes, you will create bits of technology in your work that you'll be able to sort of reuse and repurpose, and there's nothing wrong with that. And it's a great way of financing and also supporting your work. So on something a bit different. So I talk about things being a bit multi-sensorial, using all of the senses, because I'm actually showing you a presentation and it's largely very, very visual. And there's been some soundscapes, and I've talked a bit about interaction, but we haven't talked much about sound, we haven't talked much about tactility, and we haven't talked much about smell. So this was a commission from a perfume museum in Paris, the first independent perfume museum. And they had a series of installations that told a story of how perfume is created, how it's developed, how it's used, some of the characteristics of it. And we were asked to create an exhibit which would explain the relationship between the perfumer and their assistant. And obviously this is sort of quite interesting, because obviously if we're creating an artwork for an environment, we go and find our own story and we experiment. But here, this is a sort of very precise sort of conversation. And one of the things we were made aware of is that the perfumer's assistant typically uses a piece of furniture, which you can see on the right here, which is like a table, but with these step tiers where you store all the ingredients. And it's called a perfumer's organ. So it's like a musical organ, but rather than playing notes, you're reaching for ingredients. And historically, they're these sort of beautiful timber pieces of furniture. In order to do our research, we visited IFF, which is a big perfume design company in Paris, who is responsible for a lot of the sort of leading perfumes in the world. And the real life isn't quite as beautiful as that. So this is the modern day version, and you've got these kind of racks of ingredients, and there's this really kind of interesting relationship between the perfumer and their assistant. So the perfumer will come up to the perfume assistant with a little recipe on a piece of paper and hand it over, and they mix it. And that still happens now, and it's kept for 28 days, where they just see how stable it is, and they see how volatile it is. I.e., have some of the ingredients lost their aroma, essentially. So one of the things we were thinking about, and on the right here, we remembered that there was this guy called Frank Gilbreth, who did these amazing studies of people in spaces, and he created these light paintings. We've all seen light paintings, but these light paintings are over 100 years old. And he analyzed, along with his wife, he worked with his wife, they analyzed how people worked in space and created these movements. And we thought, what if the perfumer's assistant has a sort of set of movements that we can actually create in light? And we've all seen beautiful light traces created by violinists and skaters and all sorts of things. So we thought, well, could we create a lights trace which is very highly controlled and structured? And our pitch, our sort of competition sketch for this exhibit looked a bit like this. We're like, let's take these traces from this sort of metaphorical, this sort of reference of the perfumer's organ in the background, and they're all coming down into the recipe that's being created at the center. And we're using our idea was to use a matrix of white laser light coming in to create this sort of this dance or this performance of this perfume being made. And obviously we did lots of work thinking about the scale and the size of this organ. So all of our work, we're continually jumping backwards and forwards, thinking what does this kind of look like, and what size and shape is it? So yeah, lots of parametric modeling here, i.e. we can change some little parameters and it means it moves around. I'm sure some of you may be familiar with programs like Grasshopper or certain ones where you can tune numbers and change what you're looking at quite easily. This is Houdini, but you can probably see that.
Yo, Jason, that's what you told me anyway.
So this is a plan of the artwork. So if you look closely, we actually have all the ingredients laid out in terms of real ingredients, which we'd really use in perfumes. So the green are woody notes, the pink is floral, etc., etc. The yellow is citrus. And then we had 5 different perfumes we were trying to make. Now, we don't always, sometimes quite a lot, we're thinking about new technologies and working. We hadn't actually done much work with lasers before, so we were testing our abilities to move and bounce lasers around a space. Now, actually, lots of challenges here. You think you might bounce a laser through a prism, but you get things reflecting back out the prism, which are quite dangerous. So you need to think about that. Lasers do blind people. So we have to think about what class of laser we use, how strong they are. We had to build special black boxes in the studio, excuse me, in order to do these tests. But the finished piece. each of those crystals illuminating represents an ingredient. Each of the crystals, when it's hit by the laser, makes a certain type of noise, which is matched to the ingredient it comes from. So like if it's a citrus, our sound designer created a sound that vibrated very quickly. The decay curve of the sounds relates to the volatility of each ingredient. So if it's an ingredient that the smell disappears quite quickly, the sound decreases really quickly. So there's a process called, which you might as a funny word, called synaesthesia, which is the mapping of one sense onto another sense. So we're using that here. So it's a very clever tool. So it's like, if you see something, what does that sound like? Or if you hear something, what does it look like? And it's a very, very important way of strengthening work. So synaesthesia. Site visits, yeah, very important. This is the Wadden Sea, a very important piece of mudflat in a piece of sea between the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. And we were commissioned to help create a museum or a new visitor center with an exhibition company called Jack Studio from Copenhagen. And essentially it's a visitor center that celebrates this rich environment. Lots of birds migrating in and out, 22 million a year, and wonderful seabirds that feed on the inhabitants of the mudflats. You get this amazing phenomenon called black sun in English. It's and you say it in Danish it's sort, and it's when you get so many birds in the sky, the sky goes dark. And then you get these murmurations of seabirds. And this is the hilltops of the city of Ribe, which is the oldest city in Denmark. And we got to the site, it looked like this. They were about to start refurbishing the buildings and adding some new buildings. By the time they finished, it looked more like this. It's actually thatched. So it's got like a reed on the outside. And our idea was to create this kind of moving flock of birds that represented this environment outside. And this was the final space in the museum to talk about the ecology and the environment and the relationship. And quite often you want to create a sketch like this that just evokes what you're trying to do. So again, this is our sort of competition sketch. It's just an idea. There's not people in it. It's not kind of completely photoreal, but it gives you an idea of something transparent, something that's sort of perhaps, is that a flock of birds? It gives you an idea of the space it might sit in. Now, we had to develop a kind of an exhibit that both could be projected on that told the story of these birds. This is us building a screen which you could project upon, again, breaking up the idea of the sort of projection map and something you're back projecting onto. And we're, again, creating these very simple screens. And testing some documentary footage being projected onto them, creating our own projection mapping, but then also mapping onto what we're starting to do here is stitch from between something that's a projection into something that's low resolution. So you've got transparent liquid crystals here, which are also taking the video from the right, essentially. So you've got low resolution and high resolution working together. This will all become apparent. That's us looking with the client. And this is some of the parametric design happening. So how we're exploring. So you can see really we were essentially looking at a small part of that there. We were looking at a little piece of that installation to understand how it might look. So you look at the size of things, can people touch them? And then it was actually a project we installed ourselves. So a lot of our projects, we do become the contractor. So when you're creating work, obviously you've got to decide, or it'll be apparent whether you're a kind of an artist and you're designing and building everything yourself, or whether you're creating designs which are built by others. And it does sometimes change what you're able to do. And actually, it might sound obvious, but it's quite an interesting thing to think about when you start a project. Are we building this? Are we responsible for building it? Or is someone else going to be responsible for building it? And we hand over like a set of IKEA kind of do-it-yourself instructions. And this is us mapping our software, the movement of the birds, onto this giant sort of volumetric chandelier. This is the finished article. So this is a permanent installation, part of an exhibition about these birds and this ecology and this environment. We've got a high resolution system speaking to and talking with a low resolution system that are about this ecology, about this sort of environment. And it's something that's sort of a permanent addition to this museum in Denmark. I talked a bit about this yesterday and I thought I'd expand on it. This project for the Barbican Art Centre in London. And this is how the Barbican Art Centre was created. The textures were actually created by hand, people using mechanical jackhammers, sort of the pneumatic devices to create this dimpled effect on the concrete. This was our site. And this was what I showed you yesterday, which was these sort of dynamic moving components based on these machines travel across it. So again, just some of the background in terms of making those. So these are some of the first tests we did in the studio electromechanically. Starting to think about what do these machines look like? Can they create patterns? What happens when you add color? So this is sort of matching. So you can sort of see us slowly building up the complexity of what we're doing. We've got triangles here, but what happens if it's more like a cog? And obviously we have to draw what we're doing. So the drawings do start to get quite complicated. And there's 11,000 components in each of these panels. But what we were thinking was, like, how do we activate these? Where do we scavenge for energy? Where do we borrow, information from? Where do we borrow information? So we're thinking, like, could we scavenge little bits of information from Instagram, from the different partners, and sort of put that onto the context of the installation? So you can sort of see us sort of scraping from Instagram and putting it into the installation. Now, if I remember correctly, I think we're doing this in Unity here. So let me just check. Yeah. We were starting to think about, well, how do we test this environment for all sorts of things? Like, how does it respond to music potentially? So like from an orchestra. And presence. And we're using VR a lot in this project because it had to be safe. And this is sort of, taking recordings from people moving and using HTC Vive set just to sort of look at the artwork. So again, using, so this is quite useful talking to like the planners, the traffic engineers, people that were kind of worried about what the artwork might look like in what's it going to do when it's sat in a highway. And that's it installed and working. So this is a project called Life in the Dark. It was an exhibition about creatures, animals, systems that all exist in the dark, from nocturnal environments in like woodlands in the UK. This is the Naturalist Museum in London. And thinking about immersing yourself, creating an exhibition that's purely dark, and how can you do that? How is it safe? Starting from a forest, going into a cave, and then going into the deep sea. And we collaborated with a company called Nissan Richards. So this is a sort of general arrangement of an exhibition like this in a big exhibition hall. And we developed a sort of series of, so this was one piece we created, which was a hand illustrated animated wood. We used a series of recycled projectors and a big scrim, basically to create a continually changing generative hand sketched animation. So a mix of technologies. So yeah, created by hand, but using layering to sort of create something that sort of continually changed. We collaborated with some animation students from the Royal College of Art. Lots of use of real taxidermy, where you could actually touch the animals. Use of kind of theatrical immersive theatre to sort of create environment. So this was a very, very cost-effective way of creating the idea of going into a cave. So the bats that are hanging are literally just mobiles made from plywood, and we've got a couple of lines of LEDs. The whole thing was mocked up in Unity so we could understand how complex it could be. But this is the process. So we used sort of simple origami process to sort of look at just sort of really to say, look, how simple a process could be, really, to think about creating theatre. There's always music playing in the studio. So it gives you a flavour of how to develop environments that can be very cost effective. Now, this environment was the deep sea. So things like the anglerfish on the left, which looks quite brutal, but creating a representation of all these bioluminescent conversations that are going on. And we built this environment in Unity. This is looking through both of the kind of two goggles of the eye set, looking at the relationship between the exhibits and the immersive bioluminescence environment. So the color of light is exactly matching the light of the plankton and the fish in the deep sea. We work with the scientists at the Naturalist Museum. We're representing 10 species that all have different types of flashes of light that talk to each other and create this sort of immersive theatre, which is like being in the twilight zone in the deep sea. It's a system we had to completely develop because it didn't exist commercially. Very, very fine, like piano wires draped from the ceiling with these tiny pinpricks of addressable light in exactly the right color of light for the deep sea. So this was a collaboration with a few companies, but it was for Sight Savers, a charity in the UK who are looking at saving the people's sight across the world. And there's a disease called trachoma, which exists quite a lot in the third world, which is quite simple to cure with the right drugs. And essentially your eyes get infected and your eyes go blind because of your eyelashes scratching your eyes, which is not very nice. But anyway, so we came up with an idea for creating an exhibition where the exhibition got destroyed every time you blinked your eyes. So in the same way, there's a metaphor for your eyes getting damaged. So we started to develop a piece of work where it tracked how often you blink. And we worked with a whole series of very famous photographers to destroy their photographs based on things blinking. So I added these artifacts, these glitches that slowly appeared in their photographs based on people blinking. So this exhibition was destroyed over the period of a week. And it was all to sort of bring a focus onto this sort of terrible disease and highlight it. So you can just sort of see, and our input really was to create a system which could track any blink in that environment. There's a Nick Cave photograph being slowly destroyed. So there you go. I'm going to stop for some questions and a conversation now. But that's a little bit of a kind of journey through some of the exhibition work we're doing and some of the techniques we're using, which I hope are useful and interesting. And again, very happy to take any questions, and also if any questions that crop up afterwards that are a bit more in depth, happy to answer those and sort of send you back some written replies as well. So thank you very much for your time. And yeah, let's see what you've got to say. I'm really interested to see what you thought.
Jason, it's always like amazing to see how I mean the work executed is really exquisite, and in particular when I think about, because I also play with like electronics and physical computing, and I know it's not easy to synchronize different modules together and have a very smooth like interactions and being very robust. Would you mind to share a bit more about your tips on how to produce a project that is really robust and be able to have a very good, like in terms of the maintenance, very easy for people who doesn't have like the background, but still be able to take care of the work?
Well, there's a few things there. So quite early on, when you're creating a project, you've got to think about how long it's got to run for, really, because you can hack something together using you know, kind of the knowledge you gain. I mean, as this kind of student, using sort of Arduinos and using single board computers and using sort of fairly kind of simple software. And if you're creating something that's not going to last very long and it's sort of fairly simple, that might work. But I suppose it's also thinking about whether it's standalone or whether it's got to talk to the rest of the system. So then you get into, like, for example, the project we did in Denmark, our installation there had to talk to the lighting system. So you've got to think about, can what I'm using talk to the lighting system? Do they talk the same language? But it also had to talk to the AV controls for the entire museum. So it's making sure that whatever you're using has interfaces. That means, so can it be switched on and off by the people easily is a really good thing, because that's actually the biggest problem ever, is people turning your work on and off. Primarily because it gets unplugged and does it restart? Another thing, actually, in terms of that sort of thing, power supply and interruptions to power supply are actually really common, weirdly. I mean, again, electricians turning something off, turning it back on again. We've gone on maintenance visits, cleaners unplugging servers, all sorts of things. Another thing you can do is put a UPS, an uninterrupted power supply in. So basically, if someone switches something off and on accidentally, even if it's labeled, do not turn this off, once someone realizes, you might have half an hour supply in a battery basically that keeps it running. So that's one thing, because that's most of your problems are people turning work off accidentally. And also, how does it reboot? How does it start again, standalone? Because you don't want to have to go and start a piece of work if it's on the other side of the country or the other side of the world. And the other thing that we're doing on all of our projects at the moment is looking at what is the remote kind of system. So it could be something simple like TeamViewer, where you literally can see the control computer from where you are in your office at home. And again, you can troubleshoot without having to go there all the time. And that's kind of really, really, really key. And then the other thing we have, and I mentioned it on the Victoria and Albert piece, it's like thinking about how do things get replaced. So you could create a wonderful hanging installation, and it's in a big lobby of a hotel or in a museum or wherever it is, but it's 3 stories up in the air. How we always ask our client, what kind of access? Do you have a little kind of scissor lift or a spider, they're called, a little something that someone can get to it really easily overnight if something goes wrong or something needs replacing? And that's almost nearly my first question, is how can something get accessed if it doesn't work? Because it's probably one of the worst things for anyone working with technology on work that's meant to be impactful and amazing, is any downtime or any time it's broken, you want to reduce that obviously to the minimum, unless it's planned, because obviously you can plan to turn things off and turn them on, but you've also got to think about what do they look like when they're turned off. Things can still look beautiful when they're turned off, and that can be very considered, or it can be in a resting state, or what we used to have screensavers. We don't really need screensavers anymore because the technology, you don't very often get burn-in on screens anymore. You can, but it's not really needed. So how do things turn on and off? How can you look at them remotely? How do you access them? And also, every piece of work we create instructions for people that there's the simple one page, like these are the 10 things to try if it's not working for some reason. First thing is, have you turned it on and off? Or power cycling. 2, I mean, and again, you go through some of the key things, have you restarted things in this order? And then you get to the bottom where it's, phone the maintenance company or phone the artist or the creators. And we will also generate a manual. We also generate, you want to generate spares. So you might make something, and you think, I'm hanging 10 of these things up, and they're amazing. They're talking to each other. I create this great installation. And then you're 3 days in, and there's some failure with one of them. Ideally, you want 1 or perhaps 2 spares, 10 to 20%. I mean, that sounds a lot, but it will really save you. So, man, if you're building installations that are going to go outside, and you've got 100 units, either make 110 or reduce the number and have some spares. Because even when you're making them, and you might have some accidents along the way, hopefully not, you want to make sure that you can complete what you've sold to your commissioner, your tutor, your collaborators, and having spares looks good. It makes you more relaxed. You're less worried about the odd mistake that might happen. Energy, other questions you want to get about work will be, what energy does it use? Very often that's becoming more and more important, obviously, and it should do. So being able to calculate how much power something's going to use is also useful. And again, that is also to do with turning things on and off. So things that are on standby use a lot of energy, and things that are on use a lot of energy. So how do you turn things on and off? And also, if you've got an artwork using a screen or a projector, whatever it is, everything has a number of hours it's going to last. So there's no point having things on when people aren't there. And there's no point, and you may as well increase the lifespan of the components if you can. So if you turn things off and have them on 8 hours a day rather than 18 hours a day, you might have something suddenly lasting 10 years rather than 5 or 6 years. So there's all sorts of, lots of kind of learnings really about making things robust. Think very, very carefully about moving parts in anything. It's like maintaining a car. Compare a diesel or petrol car to an electric car. Look at the maintenance in comparison to the two of them. Think about the things that move. And again, all of those things will have an amount of time between services. Kinetic things are beautiful. There's some like luminokinetic things that move and illuminate and change are my favorites. However, they are the worst to maintain. It's not to say you can't, but it's just to say that you need to think about every little thing that moves. And if you're not a mechanical engineer, enlist the help of a mechanical engineer potentially on your project. And you can design out a lot of failure and you can think about how things need to be serviced. But again, those little pandas I showed you that span on, that's probably our most, I mean, it's been running quite well now for probably 4 or 5 years, but I think we changed the stepper motors probably 5 or 6 times in the first probably 10 years it was running, but it's got better now. But again, it's, you know, you just got to, clients are going to want to know what is the cost of running something. Now, the interesting thing is sometimes the cost of buying something up front versus the cost of running it are 2 different things. And sometimes the client will have more money to run something than they will to buy it up front. So it's not that doesn't matter, but you need to think about it. Sorry, long answer to the question. Hope that was useful.
Yes. And yesterday after your lecture, I've got a email then from Raymond. Yeah, and he said, "Thank you for your sharing. Is it very impressive?" And I think he want to ask about what do you think about the digital art with the virtual environments? Because he said you got many very good idea in physical environment with space. But how about AR, VR, and MR? What do you think if the environment maybe not physical exist, people maybe wear headset or some portable device to experience and interact with space? So what do you think that this kind of digital art?
I mean, obviously in the last year, particularly, mixed reality and all its different types has kind of come on leaps and bounds. And we use both HTC Vive headsets. We use Oculus headsets in the studio as tools. As you see, we use Unity a lot, a tiny bit of Unreal, to visualize work, but also to look at content on work. That's one thing we're doing. We have exhibited work separately. So like the Natural History Museum work, we exhibited just purely in VR as well. And so I think there's opportunities to create digital twins, to create kind of versions of work. It increases your audience. You can suddenly have a piece of work that's physical, but you can share it again after it's finished, or you can share it online and broadcast it. Essentially, you can broadcast in VR, or you can share it as something downloadable that people can experience. So suddenly you've got a massive audience, and it's something we're thinking about very carefully for our project in Tokyo this summer, where our audience has disappeared. I mean, the global audience has disappeared. They're not going to be in Tokyo, and hopefully there'll be some local audience, but obviously again reduced. So we're thinking about, suddenly I was in the world of creating sort of physical, obviously quite often digital but physical environments, but how do you increase your audience? How do you create a big audience? And I think sort of mixed reality, VR, anything in between has quite a big place to play in that, because it means that people you've got a much larger, what we'd call a footprint. So the kind of the sphere of influence of your work becomes a lot larger. So, and whether that's a representation of the work, it's a mirror or a digital twin, which is essentially a carbon copy of it digitally, or whether it's some kind of representation of it or documentation. There are lots of ways of looking at it. That's how that's affecting me. I mean, obviously there's a lot of work that's happening that's native to that environment and starts there and stays there. And I think that's equally really interesting. And I've seen a lot of work this year, especially that's been done in research and with students, where they are pitching, presenting work, and it's existing only in VR. And it's fascinating. But for me, the richness of this world is the hybridization of that. It is the things that exist have a physical version and an online version simultaneously. And obviously that's where the augmented worlds get really, really interesting. And what we are doing at the moment, we're creating mock-ups of projects, prototypes, and then we're mapping the augmented version onto them, so you can sort of see the rest of it in the augmented world. And we're in the middle of that at the moment. I'd like to share some of it, but it's a bit too early. And that's a really interesting tool, is layering both of these things together. So I think there's a lot there. We've been working with we're working quite a lot with Magic Leap, which was sort of quite low resolution, but kind of really interesting. Sketching installations we've been developing recently to sort of put them into rooms. We're exporting into AR for quite a lot. Like this morning, earlier this morning, I was critting some work we're doing for a project in Dubai, and I was looking at some steelwork details in my living room on my iPad, and I was walking around them, just sort of looking at them. So it's completely part of what we're doing. I think it's great. I mean, there's no kind of limits really to your creativity and what you can do with that. And it's being used in theatre, it's being used in choreography, it's being used in art. It's pervasive across, I think, all creative arts at the moment. So, and I think anyone that's sort of learning the tools of the trade that allow you to do that, it's, you know, I'm sketching personally in Gravity Sketch. So I'm doing some sketch work in that, just to sort of understand some things in 3D. My 3D work's not as good as it used to be, because I have people that are very, very good at it. And but I do some sketching in 3D now. So it has meant I'm sketching in my Oculus Quest, so Quest 2. So I'm able to sort of quickly sketch something probably quite complicated in 3D and sculptural forms and things, so that I can hand them over to my computational designers and my visualizers to say, look, that was the form. I was thinking more of that form. And rather than me sketching a 2D flat thing, I'm sending them a sketch that's 3D. So lots of exciting things there.
Yeah, I think all about the storytelling. So what is the story and concept, and use the right technologies, right media to execute your work. Yeah.
I mean, that's the key thing really, is making sure you know what you're doing first and why you're doing it.
Yes.
It's the sort of most important thing, because don't start a project and say, I've got to do this in VR. It may be it's part of the parameters of doing the project, but it should be, what am I trying to do and why am I trying to do it? And start with paper. And that would be my advice. It doesn't matter how badly you sketch. Start with something or a simple device where you're writing or creating some very simple sketches, and you think through what it is you're trying to do. I mean, you may be natively thinking through something in VR, amazing, but you know, I would encourage you to think about, why are you doing what you're doing? What are you trying to achieve? Yeah. And then it becomes, because it may be you create some technical poverty within your project. You might create a piece of work that you don't have access, the right people don't have access to it. It's because you might create something in VR, but then this is for a section of the community or population that doesn't have headsets or appropriate devices. So you've got to think about who you're creating work for and where it's for. I mean, VR is fantastic. It's a tool. It's another tool, essentially, currently for me.
And I have a questions. Yeah, I remember that you said you are the conductor of your studio. So you are managing different kind of expertise with different background, like computering, artist, designer, engineering. How can you mix everything in harmonies? It seems like really difficult. They have different point of view with different, maybe they have different concerns. So how can you make it?
Well, that's a good question. And sometimes we're talking different languages. And I suppose I've spent a lot of time practicing how to talk in different people's languages. So if I'm talking to mechanical engineers, I know enough about mechanical engineering to ask questions about things I don't look right, or ask questions about the sizes of things or how things are going together. Similarly, I have, I can code and I have an understanding of coding. I don't on a daily basis. I haven't for quite a long time, but I can still query and I can still debug the process and understand if we're creating a sketch in something, why is it taking that long? Where are we stuck? What are the things? Is there an easier way of doing that and exploring it? And it's probably similar for a lot of the processes in the studio. I have an understanding of process. So it's like, I'd say anyone trying to create work that sits in this sort of world, there are a lot of skills, and it's quite good to have an understanding of the skills, perhaps do some initial training, but you don't necessarily need to become a coder. Although that's fantastic and probably quite useful. You don't need to become a visualizer necessarily. You don't need to become a storyboarder. You don't need to become a UX designer. I mean, there are certain things that will be very specialist. But if you have an understanding of things, it means you have conversations. But it is an art form in terms of trying to work out, put yourself in someone else's shoes and think about what are they trying to achieve through what they're doing, and then going back into thinking it from your point of view. So you can sort of see if there's a mismatch or the communication isn't quite working, thinking about why that is the case.
Yes, you are a really good conductor. Yes. Anyone have questions? Then you can put in the chat box.
I'm actually very curious about when you start to work on the first commissions project. How was it be, like the process, and would you mind to share with us?
Some of the early work. It was, part of the challenge really when I first started working was when I had no built work of my own. It was convincing people to take a risk on commissioning me to do work. And I think the one thing that probably helped me there was my training as an architect and my practice as an architect, because the ability to be able to draw very clearly what I was trying to do and draw that technically and organize it was convincing. So practicing your communication skills, practicing your presentation, and practicing it on other people that are experienced as well, is a really good way of being able to get commissions and get work. But you've got to practice all the elements of it. So practicing giving presentations actually is really key. And part of that practice is me going, how do you fix that? That looks like that might break. What's the idea? Is the idea good enough? Why are you doing it? And if you can answer all those things and you become practiced at it, that's sort of quite a lot of the part of the process. But part of it is really, you've got to have some self-initiated work to show that kind of shows people what you might do. And some areas of the world versus others, culturally, you also have got to show more work up front in order to get commissioned. So it's like trying to navigate that process as well, of like, what is it you're doing and we might commission you to do it. And it's like, well, you're commissioning me for a process. You've quite often got to educate people on what they're going to commission you to do. What is the actual process? Why does it take a lot of time? Why should they pay that much money to do it? What are the steps involved? So sometimes actually there's quite a bit of education involved. So we might take people through the process of developing a piece of work in the studio and how long does it take typically, and how long does each part of that journey take. So we might develop a brief for the commission. We might send that back to the client and say, we think this is what you've asked us to do, and this is kind of how we're going to move forward. And each step of the way, this is what work we're going to produce in order to sell the idea to you. And it's a very, very kind of methodical step-by-step process.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Thank you for your sharing. It's a fruitful day. Thank you. Then
You're
this is-
very, very welcome.
Yeah, then this is the end of our lecture. So thank you. Maybe if we have chance, then we can check later. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you
the
very
way-
much. And you've got recordings of, are you able to share the recordings with me, just so I've got a copy of them?
Yes, sure. Thank you. I will
And
send.
then, yeah, that'd be perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye,
So
everyone.
thank you very much, everyone. Really good to see you, and I'll keep in touch.
Yeah, keep in touch. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.